Now, let's get things started on our interview segment. The Nigerian tax system is no doubt confronted with many issues and challenges, such as multiplicity of taxes, bad administration, non-availability of database, tax touting, amongst others, a development that has continued to hinder the realization of the full potentials of tax to development of the country. Although several reforms have been made to reposition the Nigerian tax system, the system is still fraught with contending issues which have made the country suffer from low tax to GDP ratio standing at 6%, which is significantly lower than average African countries, which stands at 18%. Now, with dwindling oil revenues, the federal government has made attempts to increase its non-oil revenues, especially tax revenues, through the introduction of new and/or further increases in existing pro-health taxes, raking in 1.09 trillion naira in 6 months. Let's get to discuss and, of course, dissect more on this issue and other contending issues affecting the Nigerian tax system. I'm now being joined live virtually by the Associate Director of Corporate Tax Consulting, PwC Nigeria, Emeka Chime. He joins me live on the show. Thank you so much, Emeka, for agreeing to speak with us here on Business Nigeria. And wonder perhaps just how are you receiving this story of raking in 1.09 trillion naira in indirect taxes?
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure for me to be on your show. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Go ahead, please, with your thoughts. Nice to have you on the show.
Great. Yes, so I think that's something that the government has been looking to do to raise non-oil revenue, especially through indirect taxes. So the focus on indirect taxes is something that the national tax policy of 2017 actually enshrined, right? And Nigeria is essentially aligning with the national tax policy. But however, some conversations need to be had as to whether these indirect taxes were properly evaluated when they were being introduced. I mean, considering current realities and economic hardship, we're seeing recent introductions of, for example, excise duties on telecommunications services, right? So if you consider that telecommunication services already attract VAT at 7.5%, with this introduction, you're talking about an additional 5% to take it up to 12.5%. I think what we need to understand is that, telecommunications, especially on data that this has been introduced on, is something that many Nigerians, especially the ones, struggling with businesses, use for their businesses. Maybe something the government may have considered is to include a threshold so as to exclude, Nigerians at the lower level. Maybe should have introduced it for people that spend certain amounts and above, or people that use postpaid packages and things like that, right? Because at this time, the impact might just be increased hardship on majority of people.
I mean, I remember Mr. President promising Nigerians to uplift 100 million Nigerians out of poverty. You wonder perhaps if this will further plunder Nigerians into poverty?
Absolutely, and that's the conversation. I mean, so there's usually the conversation of whether we are taxing the seed versus whether we are taxing the fruit, right? So like I mentioned, data, especially with the way the world is going, is, one of the key, things that businesses use to run, especially small businesses that trade online and things like that, right? So maybe the focus would have been, taxing, if you use my term, the fruit, right? At that level. So it's kind of contradictory, but then we'll see how it goes, because the focus on indirect taxes continues to be more intense. I mean, and we're not just talking about telecommunications. We've also seen the sugar taxes that have recently also been introduced on, beverages. We've also seen things like conversations to even increase VAT in the future without, giving room for reprieve for the masses.
Mm-hmm. All right. Let's also discuss other issues. Perhaps we'll come back and discuss some of the policies of the current administration. But Nigeria suffers from low tax compliance, and the country's tax to gross domestic product ratio stands at 6%, which you have also given a mention. This, of course, significantly lower than the average African countries and neighbors we have around us. I wonder how you would respond to this.
Yes. I think that from our tax to GDP ratio perspective, what might be one of the main issues is that, our tax is still very heavily focused on the formal sector. There have been recent conversations around expanding the tax base, rather than, still taxing the same set of companies, individuals that have been complying all the while. So if you look at, companies, for example, there have been recent introduction of additional taxes on companies that have already been complying. Meanwhile, we have the informal sector that is still largely untapped, and there's a lot of potential to increase our taxes, and so our tax to GDP ratio is a reflection of the percentage of the economy that we're taxing. And I'd like to give an example with South Africa. So in Nigeria, personal income taxes, that's the taxes that you and I pay on our salaries, does not contribute as much as it probably should. If you look at what the 36 states combined collected, I think last year, I don't think it wasn't up to 1 trillion naira. Meanwhile, when you look at what the South African Revenue Authority collected, it was in the neighborhood of converted 14 trillion naira. And why is that? That's because the tax system for personal income tax in Nigeria is still focused on employees, where the employers have to deduct through payee. There's still a lot of room that needs a lot of efforts that needs to be done to tax individuals and other businesses that don't have an employer in the middle to deduct these taxes at source, and also the administration issue, right? But yeah, so I think to obviously increase our tax to GDP ratio, focusing on the same taxed set of companies and people will not help us achieve that. We need to bring in the largely untapped population into the net.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll discuss the Finance Act very, very shortly and the implications and implementations of this. But I'm wondering just how dire is the urgent need for a paradigm shift in Nigeria's tax processes and tax reforms, especially considering the fact that we are in the middle of a serious inflation here in the country and the continent, and of course globally.
Right. So it's as dire as you would imagine, right? Because the government is currently in a position where oil revenues are dropping due to, I should say, obvious issues, right? Looking at subsidy and all the rest. And the next, best source of revenue for the government is taxes. We have what I like to refer to as a revenue problem, but we also have an expenses problem, right? So it's very important and critical at this point for the government to be able to harness available tools to optimize tax revenue, and like I said before, not from the same set of compliant individuals and companies.
Yes, you want to tie this to a cultural background, you may, because there are comments. I'm trying to see if I can get this out now by a board member of the Nigerian Economic Group, Frank Aigbogun, who said, quote, political leaders can lead by example by supporting a cultural change through tax compliance. You wonder if those who belong to the elites, the political class, perhaps should show the way, show leadership, show example of tax payment.
Absolutely, spot on. I mean, I think you just hit the nail on the head, and that's one of the biggest issues that we have around, taxation in Nigeria, and that's the problem of, not leading by example. And by this, we're probably referring to, the political class, even MDAs and government agencies. I mean, so if you consider that, even when you think about people running for political offices, expecting, the populace to continue to pay taxes, when at that level, there's not much scrutiny on them, either because they can buy their way out of tax audit assessments, or because the tax authorities won't just go near to them because they are connected to somebody or the other, or it's a government agency and FIRS doesn't want to audit them, even though legally they are mandated to pay taxes. So there's that problem of lack of leadership by example, and it's just very funny that at the end of the day, this political class is then in charge and become, custodians of the same tax revenue that many of them did not contribute to. I mean, when you look at all around the world, running for political office, there'll be questions around disclosing your, tax returns and your contribution to the tax system before running, right? I mean, that's standard in most parts of the world. I think maybe recently, maybe Donald Trump caused an uproar, if you remember, because he refused to do it, or maybe delayed, because at some point, he puts out some bits of his records, right? But we don't have that as standard in Nigeria. It's probably just optional or things that people do, on an isolated basis. Or maybe you find that some of these people are able to buy tax clearance certificates for like 1 year to show, some numbers that probably can't be substantiated. So anyway, just to mention that, yes, that problem of leadership by example is very, very important. And it ties all the way back to the cultural issue of, using the masses as scapegoats for certain policies that some people that are above the law, exempt themselves from.
Mm-hmm. All right. I mean, perhaps you may also give us a sense of your analysis of the Yearly Finance Act and its supports for tax legislation and policy implementation, because one would have expected that the Finance Act should have solved issues around taxation, around compliance, around supports for households and enterprises.
Yes. And I think it's not, we're not there yet, but it's a journey that we are currently undertaking. Because if you look at the Finance Act to date, there have been certain incentives that have been meted out to small and medium scale enterprises, especially in the area of exemption from CIT, companies income tax. I mean, right? If you generate revenues below 25 million, or a reduction in the company's income tax rates if you generate revenues between 25 million and 100 million, or even exempting small businesses from the obligation to remit VAT and things like that. So you can see that the tax authorities are thinking in that direction to focus their energies on the bigger companies rather than being cost inefficient, going after small businesses. So in that light, right, it has helped with increasing compliance, because what you then tend to see is that if I set up a company, I know that if I don't have more than 25 million naira in annual revenue, I'll be exempt. right? So I will set up a company rather than, operate as an enterprise, in which case I'll still be subject to tax, right? So it helps to formalize the economy and encourage, financial inclusion, right? Because people want to register and things like that. However, there's still a long way to go when you consider the fact that incentives are not the only things that drive increased tax compliance. The government needs to build trust. The government also needs to use data and intelligence to, what we like to say, connect the dots to increase tax revenue. Mm-hmm. So yeah, the Finance Act, good one. What we hope is that, the changes that come in through the Finance Act are changes that, don't take taxpayers by surprise, by introducing, punitive measures with immediate effect. Mm. The changes are introduced gradually and on a phased approach so that we don't surprise taxpayers. Mm.
All right, Mr. Emeka, let's begin to wind down on our conversation. But I'm also wondering just how problematic issues around the introduction of new taxes on corporates, the issue of Naira devolution, issues around inflation, you had touched on that a bit, issues around unemployment rate, which I understand stands now at about 33%, issues around fuel subsidy as well. How problematic are these issues when you consider taxes as well?
Yes, absolutely. So these are very burning issues, right? And rather than consolidate taxes to increase or positively impact on the ease of doing business, to attract foreign investors, or at least make foreign investors know that our system is stable, the government is introducing additional taxes, which then, have a way of impacting on our ease of doing business and therefore, quote unquote, scaring, foreign businesses because of the unpredictability. And I'll give some examples, right? So today, a company in Nigeria will pay CIT, right? They'll also be required to pay something called Tertiary Education Tax, which is supposed to fund universities. If they are banks or in the IT space, for example, they'll be required to pay NITDA levy, 1% of their profits before tax. Recently, well, not recently, but I guess it was just re-energized because the law has always been there. There's something called the NASENI levy, right? We also know about the Police Trust Fund levy to fund police operations. There were recent conversations about the NYC levy to fund NYC, and then something. So it just feels like where there are issues that government could have funded, so government just thinks about new issues to just, impose the taxes on companies that are already overburdened, right? And these can not portend positively on the economy and the other indices, right? So it's like we're going opposite of the direction that we're supposed to be going. Where we're supposed to be going is a unified or a harmonized tax system, a system where, where you buy property or you buy land or you have an account, right? The dots are connected and that data can be used to spread to a wider reach of taxpayers, right? Rather than, like I like to say, killing the goose that lays the golden egg.
All right, Mr. Emeka. Well, perhaps you could also share with us your perspective around issues around social contract. It's one thing for Nigerians to pay their taxes, it's another for them to feel the impact of what this money is paid or meant for. There's also this very disturbing issue around the trust deficit between Nigerians and the government of successive administrations. I wonder what exactly your perspective would be at this time. We'll speak about the tensions as well, geopolitical tensions and crisis as well, because there's an election just around the corner.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes. So that trust deficit, of course, does not encourage tax compliance. Every normal human being doesn't want to pay more than ₦1 above they are legally obligated to pay. But then in Nigeria, many people don't even want to pay their legal obligations, right? Because it's very disheartening in most instances that you don't see the outcome or the benefits of your taxes. I mean, we know that taxes are like they like to say technically, you don't have a direct benefit. It's not quid pro quo, right? But at least we should see some benefits. In our country today, we hear conversations around inefficiency of management of revenue. You hear conversations around stealing of crude oil, and then you begin to wonder, how a whole vessel, vessel will, these are not, small things that are being stolen. These are vessels of crude oil being stolen and other things, right? The insecurity also discouraging, FDI discouraging farmers, logistic problems discouraging farmers from taking their produce to the cities. So individuals, companies consider that they are self-sufficient as a government in their own rights, catering for their own direct needs, and don't see why in many instances they should pay taxes when the taxes are not being used for relevant social amenities, right? So we need that accountability. I don't think that the right way to go is to evade taxes because you can't see the outcome of your taxes. I still think that, as individuals, as electorates, we need to, still fulfill our social responsibilities, but then, strongly demand accountability from the leaders that we elect into positions as custodians of our president.
Let me quickly chip in this finally. So how can Nigerians perhaps demand how can Nigerians demand that the taxes they pay indeed is being how can Nigerians demand that the taxes they pay for perhaps monthly on a weekly basis it's indeed being used to ensure that they enjoy basic amenities?
Yeah, very, very good question. And I think we're getting a bit political here, right? Because it then starts to boil into, the whole voting process and, voting in the right people and things like that. But anyway, if we, consider it from, the perspective of what we as individuals do, in terms of, do we know our local government chairman? Many people don't know our local government chairman. Many people are not involved, at that grassroots level to even say, because, and we can say this of a fact, right, that there's probably some accountability at the state level. At local government level is almost just a sharing galore, right? So how participatory are we in town hall politics? How participatory are we in, asking these questions at a grassroots level before we then even, talk about the, electoral process and then, asking those questions. So for me, I would think it's just being individually participatory in, grassroots politics and then, participating also in bringing in leaders that have our interests.
Well, such a fine place to anchor our conversation. Associate Director of Corporate Tax Consulting, PwC, Mr. Emeka Chime. We'll keep our fingers crossed and we'll hope that we get to see a better Nigeria, we get to see a better Nigerian tax system as well.
Yes, absolutely. That's the hope.
All right.